Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled, What are important research questions in open access science education? Thanks for joining us. I'm Kevin McElhaney from the Digital Promise team, and I'll facilitate the agenda today. Let's see, is my video supposed to be on? There, how's that? All right. Thanks for your patience. There's three main parts to the webinar. First, we'll hear a short opening message from Jim Ryan, the Executive Director of OpenSciEd. After that, I'll give a brief overview of the working group meetings we held in the spring and the research themes that emerged from these meetings. The featured event today is some prepared remarks and an interactive discussion from our 5 distinguished panelists who are formally introduced in about 15 or 20 minutes. The panel discussion will take us just about to the end of the webinar. So with that, I'm just going to give the floor to Jim Ryan. Thanks for being a part of this, Jim.
Hi, good morning and on the West Coast for everyone here. Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. I'm thrilled that you're here, and looking forward to talking to you guys all about OpenSciEd, but also thinking with you and the panelists about our work and the upcoming possible research around OpenSciEd. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a few numbers that I'm gonna talk about that I'm hoping will make the case of why is OpenSciEd interesting as a research context. And some of those numbers my colleague Jim Short shared with attendees of the initial meeting with Digital Promise a few months ago, but then I'm going to extend on it to drive home the point that that what we're seeing is unique and capturing the market in ways that are somewhat distinct and unique from past practices. So, next slide talks about how we are a project that is driven by the vision of the materials in the project are driven by 10 partner states. These the state leaders in science have partnered with us to drive this project. And as you can see from the map here, the 10 states capture about 25% of the students in the country. They're a diverse set. I mean, we are looking at states from the South, from the West, from the Midwest, and from the East Coast. So we have a good representation of those a selection of states and teachers, and then those states provide the field test teachers for this project. And let's go on to the next slide. You can see that we are working in the development of this. We are capturing the practitioner's voice and embedding that in the publicly released materials and working with hundreds of field test teachers. And the next slide shows that multiplies into thousands of students who are engaging with these materials. And then we are capturing their voice and their reaction to learning in the way that OpenSciEd has imagined middle school science materials at this point. And then in August of 2019, we started to release these materials as units of instruction, 4 to 6 weeks long units of materials that teachers could implement, and as well as the accompanying professional learning, with the idea that rather than wait till we have the full program out, let's actually get the materials reviewed as high quality by using the EQUIP rubric, and then make them available to the market. The full middle grades materials will be out in February 2022, so in just a few months. But in those 2 years, since we've just started to release the units of instruction, we've released 10 of what will be the eventual 18. And since then, if we go to the next slide, we can it shows that if we go to the next slide, 25,000 educators, practitioners have registered with us to access these materials, and that are looking at them. Some are using them. And to give that context, there are roughly 70,000 middle school science educators in the United States. So we are already at, roughly a third of the middle grade science teachers in the country have already have shown enough interest to register with us so that they can access these material, these assets. And if we go to the next slide, we now know that right now of those 25,000 teachers have downloaded over 300,000 assets. Those are student editions, teacher guides, and slides, that type of thing, for these materials. So not only have they registered, but they're actually taking an interest in downloading and taking a look at these materials. So what we're seeing, if we go to the next slide, is that this program has the multiplication factor that we would be looking for to say that this is going to scale at the institution level, not at the outlier teacher at the end of the hallway that every school has, that is who's doing innovative things, but their practices aren't even traveling across the hallway, let alone across a district. What we're seeing is at a scale that gives us hope and indications that we are going to be seeing many larger institutions, and we're already hearing from large districts that have adopted, even prior to the full release of the materials, the entire program. So we're looking at a program that's actually going to have an impact over large swaths of the science learners in middle grades in our country. And so that brings us to, what is the logic model? What are we thinking that we'll get out of the usage of these high quality materials? So if we go to the next slide, Kevin will talk more in depth about what is the logic model of OpenSciEd, but I'd like to dive into a few questions that this brings up so that we can kind of orient ourselves as we hear from Kevin and the panelists moving forward. So as we look at this logic model, the desired outcomes are not distinct or unique for any product or service that is looking to change current practice in education. The purple boxes describe both the product and the distinctive principles and the distinct or unique delivery mechanisms that we are trying to employ for these. So those are kind of the inputs of the materials and the products and services that we're doing. But the questions really come from the blue box here. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to think about this is, if we are looking for creating lasting change in both classrooms and in the systems that think about curriculum, the institutions, mostly districts and schools, we are actually thinking about reculturing those environments. And so what are the questions that indicate what that reculturing looks like? And so if we think about the classroom, we're thinking about, how do we redefine what counts as science education away from a previous system in which facts and vocabulary took center stage to science learning, and investigations were simply a way for students to confirm what they've already read or known, but rather we're asking students to, in science learning, where students actually behave as scientists, where they are driven by a phenomena in their own questions to their own science learning. And then the other piece is thinking about a system that thinks about the selection, implementation, and ongoing support of professional learning, and moving away from the the previous paradigm of that the product knows best and we had to employ it with fidelity, but moving towards one in which teachers and school systems take ownership of the materials, and that the materials become their own as they adapt them. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm posing in as simply illustrative is what are some of the worthwhile questions, or what are some of the worthwhile framing that we should think about with OpenSciEd as an experiment and why it's worthwhile. And the top one is talking about the classroom. What role can a product play in redefining what counts as science? And the second one is the combination, those purple boxes that were in the logic model, the combination of high quality OER materials, how does that serve in reculturing policies, practices, and procedures at the institution level? So the next one is, the next slide, if we take a look at that, thinks about that top one, is we are providing a product and services that can accompany that product, and making them and removing as many barriers to the use of them, or making them as approachable as possible. But it's also recognizing the statements in the green are things that we all know, that curriculum is absolutely necessary to redefining the classroom, the science classroom, and it is inadequate as an entity into itself. And so, and then the other piece is that curriculum that asks schools and teachers to reconsider their current practice have existed for years. But the NSF curricula, the 90s and early 2000s, particularly existed. Those things came out, and they only captured 3 to 5% of the market share. So they had a lot of people talked about them a lot, but they didn't have a great deal of impact, because impact is measured in how many students are actually are the materials in. So that has to factor into this work. So as we think about the institutions where we will see OpenSciEd materials thrive, what are the other meaningful contexts that partner with curricula, or levers that partner to curriculum to create that reculturation of a classroom at scale? And so we should be measuring not only the materials, but what are those adjacent assets that are brought to bear? And then also to think about when those things don't exist, does curriculum in the desire to change the classroom create an environment in which a system brings them or builds them up so that they do exist? Can curriculum in itself lead to positive change in an institution where they don't have either the collaboration or the culture to be to work together on a project, for instance? So, and then the next question is thinking about institutions and so the next slide is thinking about, we believe that what we're offering as a package is distinct, but as individual pieces, free materials exist, editable materials for teachers, or that they can adapt exist. Quality standards aligned materials exist. Maybe they may not be OER and free or editable, but we do, but Ed Reports is given products green lights, and curriculum-based professional learning exists. So is it the combination of these things that captures this initial interest, or would or are there priorities among these things that educators find appealing and have been drawn to? And as well is how do this combination change the paradigm of going from product knows best, fidelity orientation, to an orientation in which we foster the wisdom, or that we ask that teachers bring their wisdom to the table to adapt and make the materials work for their context. And how does that happen across the system? And so bringing that, it's that ownership culture versus curriculum being purchased for them, now they own it. So thinking about how we reculture that larger district system in mindset. So those are my initial comments around how do we frame the questions that are meaningful to the practitioners and to the system, so that it informs the actions of our teachers, of our district school and district leaders. So I'm gonna finish it off there, and I can't wait to hear what my colleagues bring to bear in the upcoming panel, and hear Kevin's comments around the themes that are that this work is deriving. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing this exciting vision for science education with us. Jim's message really helps tee up the conversation about why we need to push an OpenSciEd research agenda forward. So just in the next 10 or so minutes, I'm going to give a brief overview of the process we used to identify pressing and compelling opportunities for OpenSciEd research. And I'll highlight some themes that have emerged from our synthesis of the activities we facilitated. So to quickly recap the overarching goals of this work, our central aim is to catalyze, so to speak, the development of a research community around OpenSciEd. So rather than letting a research community take years to form on its own based on the individual initiative of just a few researchers, we really want to accelerate this process by bringing people like you together, reaching some consensus on the most pressing research opportunities, facilitating partnerships, and helping researchers get their ideas off the ground and into high quality research proposals. Throughout the process, we emphasized 3 key criteria for the research priorities in that colorful triangle there, which were first, that they leverage the distinctive features and affordances of OpenSciEd that Jim was talking about. Then they center equity issues, and they address important knowledge gaps and needs in the field. So in terms of the structure of our working groups, in the spring and early summer, and with the help of our program committee, we engaged 79 participants representing different roles in science education, research, and practice. We grouped these folks into 5 topic areas based on their interests, which were assessment, pedagogy, professional learning, curriculum design, and technology. We held several meetings for each of the 5 topic areas over the course of a couple months. We engaged the groups in generating important ideas and themes for OpenSciEd research. And as the meetings progressed, together we iteratively refined, grouped, and prioritized the ideas that came up. In the final meeting, we even asked participants to outline a hypothetical research proposal to further clarify the ideas. And throughout the process, we continued to emphasize refining questions in ways that leverage, the distinctiveness, promoting equity, and addressing the gaps and needs. So in terms of the emergent themes, over the summer, our team synthesized the artifacts produced by the working groups to identify the main themes that cut across those 5 topic areas. And we arrived tentatively at these 4 themes listed here, which we noticed fell roughly into 2 bigger categories. The themes of student agency and participation, and promoting the vision of the K-12 science education framework. Both are concerned generally with what outcomes matter for OpenSciEd and for whom these things matter. And the last 2 themes you see, OpenSciEd adoption, implementation, and sustainability, and materials customization adaptation, both concern how and where OpenSciEd happens and who makes it happen. So right now I'm going to go into detail on just the customization theme, and I'll just show you a few questions that arose for the other themes, and just so we can quickly move to the panel discussion. In the fall, excuse me, in the fall, we'll share a paper that elaborates each theme in more detail. So concerning the materials customization theme, this came up very frequently across our topic areas, everything from student materials to assessments to teacher professional learning materials. The theme encompasses questions about how customizations promote equity by meeting the needs of particular student populations, the role customization could play in district adoption processes, how customization occurs, what kinds of customizations are made, and for whom, and the extent that customizations maintain their integrity to the distinctive principles and the K-12 framework. I'll pause just a few seconds so you can process these questions a little. And I see Ted Willard has added a Q&A, which is basically reflects very much the essence of this theme. So thanks, Ted, for putting that comment in. So let's just pause 5 seconds while I digest that a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. Let's see. There we go. Thanks, Irene. So here you see a version of the logic model that Jim teased in his opening remarks. And we found this logic model really helpful for elaborating relationships among distinctive features and affordances, the OpenSciEd system components, and particular outcomes of interest for each theme. So concerning materials customization, for instance, referring to the left side of the model, let's see, Zareen, could you please advance it? There we go, yeah. So where it's highlighted in red right there, right, OpenSciEd being adaptable, for instance, enables widespread customizations to the materials, while the distinctive principles like coherence from the student perspective and promoting collaborative refinement of students' ideas, these are things that really need to be preserved in customizations to both student and teacher-facing materials. In the middle, at the classroom level, customized materials can promote equity by leveraging students' existing knowledge and experiences, align with community issues that are relevant and meaningful to students, and that meet the needs of specific student populations. At the teacher supports level surrounding that, professional learning materials can be customized to align with district level policies and practices, and they can support teachers in adapting materials effectively in the classroom. And at the system level, and at the largest level, districts could benefit from resources that help them customize OpenSciEd to their own contexts, and intermediaries can customize materials and make them widely available to everyone. And across all three of these levels, research needs to attend to whether customizations maintain integrity to OpenSciEd's distinctive principles and to the framework. In terms of the outcomes on the right, customizations are potentially an important mechanism for achieving equitable student outcomes, particularly across different learning contexts. A key teacher outcome is improved capacity to make helpful adaptations and implement them successfully. For districts, customization can be a unique aspect of the curriculum adoption process. And finally, widely available customized materials, resources, and tools are an important design-based outcome in themselves. So considering a learning sciences researcher who's interested in adapting OpenSciEd to engage students, say, with local science phenomena having particular relevance to their community. So next slide, please. A design-based study like this might light up particular parts of this logic model. So for example, this model helps articulate how these adaptations leverage the instructional principles of being coherent to students and being phenomena-driven. The researcher could modify student materials and create tools that help teachers promote equitable student engagement with place-based phenomena. Outcomes of interest in this hypothetical study could include student learning, equitable participation, teacher self-efficacy, and resources for developers to make high-quality place-based customizations. Next slide, please. So for each of the other three themes that we identified, I'd like just to show a set of broad questions that represent the scope of that theme. I'll just pause, instead of reading it to you, I'll just pause for about half a minute on each one to give you a little time to digest them. Again, our fall paper will discuss each theme in more detail. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So these are questions that came up regarding the theme of promoting the vision of the framework. thanks, Jeremy, for the comment that these are intended to be example questions. They're not comprehensively describe the full scope of these themes. And next slide, please. So these are some issues that came up with regard to sustainable adoption and implementation. And hopefully these questions stimulate all of you to generate even better and more detailed questions. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to close this segment by highlighting a handful of questions that did not come up as prominently across the working group discussions, but that we think are still really important to raise. So for example, the conversations we had tended not to make strong distinctions among the different grade bands, probably because currently only the middle school materials are available. As materials at the other grade bands are released, we expect research priorities might differ across these grade bands. Another example is that the working group discussions tend to focus on the dramatic pedagogical shifts that teachers have to make for OpenSciEd, but the role of teachers' knowledge of the content of the K-12 framework will continue to be important. Third, the working group conversations tended to focus on in-service teachers, and we wondered what role OpenSciEd could have in educating and preparing pre-service teachers. And finally, conversations about equity tended to revolve around meeting the needs of students, but teachers face equity issues too. So how can OpenSciEd promote equity for teachers? So at this point, next slide, please. We're going to shift to the panel discussion. So I'll describe the format of the next segment and introduce our 5 panelists. We've asked each panelist to prepare up to 5 minutes of remarks on our initial draft of the research themes, which we sent them in advance. We also invited our working group participants and other colleagues to submit some questions about OpenSciEd research they're interested in hearing the panel talk about. So after the prepared remarks from each panelist, I'll pose some of the questions to the panel for interactive discussion. And this will take us just about to the end of the webinar. So now for some quick introductions. Angela DeBarger is Education Program Officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, where her project portfolio has a particular emphasis on open educational resources. Michael Ford is Lead Program Director at the National Science Foundation, where he's worked across many STEM programs in the Division of Research on Learning in formal and informal settings. Tiffany Neal is Deputy Superintendent in Curriculum and Instruction with the Oklahoma State Department of Education. She's been involved in efforts to implement OpenSciEd in Oklahoma schools. Eileen Carlton Parsons is Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also the immediate past president of the National Association for Research and Science Teaching and Science Policy Fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And Trish Shelton is currently Chief Learning Officer for the National Science Teaching Association and formerly Director of Professional Learning and Standards Implementation for NSTA. So please welcome our panelists with virtual applause. And Angela, we will start the opening comments with you.
Great. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Well, thank you, Kevin, for that introduction, and Jim as well. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts here. So as a program officer at Hewlett, our work and interests very much center around both making sure that students not only have access to the resources they need to be successful, but also making sure that students and teachers have agency and freedom to create and adapt approaches to more directly connect with their interests, with their experiences and their identities. That's really that intersection of what we call open education and deeper learning. And while it's possible to explore these areas with many educational programs, I believe that OpenSciEd and its collaborators through this larger research community are uniquely positioned to take this on. So the research agenda made a lot of sense to me. And for starters, I appreciated the focus and attention on equity. And I know that the team at OpenSciEd is committed to continuing to use evidence to evolve and develop what this looks like. So when I see questions like, how can OpenSciEd materials and professional learning support adaptations that respond to their students' ideas and identities? And how can technologies enhance students' capacity for self-expression? I'm confident that the development team at OpenSciEd is going to take the findings to heart and figure out ways to improve their approach. I was also glad to see equal attention to materials and teacher practices and questions that probe around developing communities of practice. OpenSciEd is really unique as a curriculum publisher operating at this scale to simultaneously and thoughtfully develop instructional materials, teacher professional learning, and partnerships with states and districts. And it's important that the research helps us understand how to effectively support these communities locally within a district and then across districts and states and through the national network of OpenSciEd partners. And another reason I'm so excited to see these kinds of questions in the research agenda is that they're not only important for moving the field of science education forward, they're important for advancing the field of open education. For too long, open education research has focused mostly in the higher education context on questions like what happens to student outcomes when you swap proprietary textbooks with openly licensed textbooks. Now, those studies were important and they served a purpose, but they don't help us understand the potential teaching and learning benefits of open. This research agenda does. And at the end of the day, we're going to know a lot more about what it takes to support curriculum adaptations, what new adoption and implementation models are possible, and whether these kinds of open educational resources and practices actually result in better teaching and learning. At the same time, I feel there are ways we can push even further with this research agenda, particularly because of the unique affordances of the OpenSciEd program. And so there are three areas I wanted to highlight here. The first, I think there's an opportunity to ask more questions more explicitly around racial equity in science education. I know that this is something that the OpenSciEd team has been thinking about, for example, with their COVID-19 health equity units. So I'm curious to know more about the ways that culture and race specifically are and could be addressed in the development of materials, in professional learning, and in customizations of lessons. I also see an opportunity for this research agenda to more deeply explore questions about coherence in creating equitable systems of instruction, professional learning, and assessment because of the unique way that OpenSciEd has developed community. What can we learn about the coordination of enabling conditions and the learning and sharing that needs to be supported across levels in the system to create more equitable conditions for science learning? And finally, coming back to this from an open education perspective, I believe there's a more extensive set of questions we can examine about the decisions around open licensing and sustainability from a programmatic or organizational standpoint. So for example, to what extent has the decision to make materials open facilitated growth and partnerships for OpenSciEd? And how does OpenSciEd operate in a sustainable way in a world of competitive district curriculum adoptions and procurement processes? Well, I'd love to see attention to those areas. In short, I'd say I'm very excited about the direction that this research agenda is headed. Again, I believe that this research is not only going to advance the field of science education by helping us to understand what it takes to create and support high quality instruction, will also advance the field of open education by providing evidence about what it takes to build capacity with a new model for teaching and learning using open educational resources and practices. So thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections about this new research agenda. And I'm looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you, Angela. Next, we're going to go to Michael Ford, who will be working from a set of slides.
Hi, everybody. Just to frame my comments, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about my background. I began in education as a high school math and physics teacher, and then I became a professor of actually educational psychology, and I studied learning in science, and I basically focused on the importance of scientific practices for for helping students understand what science is about. And since then, for the last 8 years now, I've been at the National Science Foundation as a program officer. But just a little bit about my background to help you understand. And so my goal really here, first of all, I have two goals, I guess. One goal is to explain the National Science Foundation's perspective on research, because my aim is to help you develop proposals that'll get funded. And so can we go to the next slide, please? So all the proposals that come to the National Science Foundation are evaluated in terms of two what we call merit review criteria. And I want to make clear that what we do at NSF is we ask you, honestly, people like you, to evaluate your colleagues' proposals in terms of these two things. Okay. The first one is intellectual merit. And intellectual merit, there's a very long definition of intellectual merit on the NSF website, but what it basically boils down to is the potential for a study to produce new scientific knowledge, something that the world didn't know before, and after the study is done, the world will now know, and to know it in a scientific way. The second criterion is broader impacts, and broader impacts basically means every other way that whatever the proposed effort will do will make the world a better place. So let's say if if kids are going to be impacted because of a study in a good way, that would be broader impacts. But that's separate from the intellectual merit, where the intellectual merit is like, what's the research going to tell us that we didn't know before? So let's go to the next slide. So if we turn our heads to the side, there's this book that's titled Pasteurs Quadrant. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a pretty major tripping point in research agendas around this kind of work. And honestly, like in my division, and I work in the education directorate and the division of research on learning. In my division, and the division of research and learning basically focuses on K-12. Basically all of our projects that we fund come into this category where you want to build something, and then you want to see what good it does, and you want to do research on it. Now, part of the tripping point is that research is a word that gets used in a lot of different ways. So you could do, let's say we could do research on the best roof to get on your house. You could do research on, how much sun exposure causes skin cancer. You could do, okay, and so that what that does, it's sort of, it's a term that for NSF, it's a very specific term. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about what NSF thinks research in this kind of a context would be. Research does not mean just looking things up, even though that is the way the word is used sometimes. And so there's this 2x2 picture out of the book. And basically it comes down to the question there is that research is inspired by, is it inspired by a quest for fundamental understanding? And there's a yes or no. And is research inspired by a consideration of use? And the answer is yes or no. And so the reason this is called Pasteurs Quadrant is because Pasteur made a lot of very basic fundamental understanding advances in knowledge, while he was also worried about better ways to take care of milk so people wouldn't get sick. And so you can think about science about being like a pure basic research. And so there you can see the name Bohr is there. And so it's based, that's an example of research where what's the atom made of? And so Bohr was someone who contributed to our understanding of what the atom is made of. In the lower right-hand cell, it's pure applied research. And the example in the book is Edison. So Edison invented the light bulb, and he was really just concerned with, okay, he was trying to figure things out, but the whole thing that he was trying to figure out was like how to make a better light bulb, basically. And the book is called Pasteurs Quadrant because in the upper right-hand corner is the example of Pasteur, where it's use inspired and also basic research. And what we get at NSF, the proposals that don't succeed very well are the proposals that end up, especially in this kind of a situation, they end up being basically in Edison's quadrant and not in Pasteurs' quadrant. So research questions become things like, what's the best way to do X? How can we make this happen? All right, that's Edison's quadrant. That's not Pasteurs' quadrant. And so if you want to apply to NSF, then you have to think about what is a basic research question. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. So what makes a fundable research question? First of all, you need to have a really strong literature review, which is comb really carefully. What does the field already know about a question? Next slide, please. And in this case, what is an important question? Some examples that come to mind that my colleagues have also mentioned earlier, especially about, I think that one of the intriguing things is an open curriculum. I just don't want, I would just also encourage you to not miss the fact that OpenSciEd was originally conceived as a way to create a curriculum about what the framework laid out as a vision for science learning, that it is three-dimensional, that there's core disciplinary ideas, there are cross-cutting concepts, and there are science and engineering practices, and they're all part of the puzzle. And there's a lot of research questions around, does it work? How does it work? Does it actually enhance understanding? In what ways does it enhance understanding? Okay, so what's an important question? I would encourage you to think about what 3D learning means, because the field we don't know that yet. Next slide, please. Lay out what are gaps in terms of what is not known. Next slide, please. How will the question be addressed given the contextual opportunity available? So OpenSciEd is a context that's created with a curriculum. And so it's sort of, I would use an analogy of a particle accelerator. The physicists spent lots and lots of money. Well, NSF spent lots and lots of money building particle accelerators in order to understand better what the world's made of. So the particle accelerator was a context for understanding something basic about the world. OpenSciEd is the same kind of a context. It's an opportunity where, all right, all this effort's been already made. What do we do with the effort? What are we going to research? What are the basic questions? What do you want to know? And how are we going to figure it out? Next slide, please. And hone the question. I mean, this is just a list I come up with because, I am a researcher and I've done a lot of research. And in my experience, doing research means iteratively going through these questions and figuring out, you might not know what the important question is in the beginning. You might not understand until you do the literature review. You might not understand until you figure what the gaps are. Next slide, please. And so this last, I want to just leave you with this citation. It's an article that was written by several colleagues of mine at NSF, and it's titled "Posing Fundable Questions in Mathematics and Science Education: And I apologize, actually, it's not one author, it's King et al. And I forgot the et al. There's 3 other authors, Oxendorf and others. But there's a citation, and I would encourage, if you want to, these are people that I work with at NSF, and that's what they wrote about fundable questions. And so I offer that as a resource. So so thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Michael. Next, we'll go to Tiffany.
Thank you, Kevin. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'll sort of dive right in to help us with our schedule a little bit today, but I wanted to give you a little background before I shared some of my thoughts on the research agenda. As Kevin mentioned, I serve as the Deputy Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. But I've been here for around 10 years. I began as the Director of Science Education. And in that time, when I started in the position, it was my role to really support the adoption of framework-informed standards and then conduct implementation support for our state to ensure that instruction for students was really aligned to that goal or that vision. As you can imagine, in that time frame, we had very few instructional materials that really aligned to that vision. And so OpenSciEd became a wonderful opportunity for Oklahoma to be a part of a pilot program to implement the OpenSciEd materials. And so we are one of the original states, as you saw, to do the middle school implementation. We're also now signed on for high school implementation. In addition to the, to the piloting work for middle school, 2 years ago, we began providing our districts who were interested in implementation support. So what that means is that we are utilizing state funds to provide professional development at no cost to the districts who wish to implement the OpenSciEd curriculum. And we have found that to be a wonderful opportunity for districts to latch on and be aware of this quality, free and open resource materials. So many people ask me in our role in state government, what is it you actually do? And a line stolen from Peter McLaren, if you know him, is that in state science supervisor roles, or even at the deputy superintendent role, I may not be the person making decisions that will impact instructional materials that then end up coming to classrooms in our state, but I certainly influence the decision makers, both at the legislative level for our elected commissioner, and also in many ways, the policies that then inform the practices of district leaders when it comes to instructional materials. So when I look at the research agenda, I think about all of the opportunity that is here to inform us at the state level regarding policy and funding practices, and also guidance that we're providing to district leaders in the remote places in our state on how they might utilize their own funding to implement this high quality curriculum. When I look at the 4 themes, I think about how interconnected they are. You really have done a nice job in identifying the essential themes that will provide us with the research, I believe, that will be needed to do this informed work in policy and funding at the state and the local level. I thought I'd just share briefly from my perspective how research under each of these themes can really inform the work that we do at a state level. So when I think about materials customization and adaptation, I think about an opportunity to have a body of research that would help me at a state level and help our district level leaders ensure that while there are opportunities for customization and adaptation, that the research informs us as to the support structures needed to ensure that the curriculum holds on to the high part of high quality that we know to be true of the free and open materials as they exist now. When I think about student agency and participation, I'm hopeful that the body of research that comes out of this theme would allow me at a state level to point to curriculum like this and say, this is the type of curriculum that leads to diversifying the student groups that are pursuing post-secondary opportunities in science and engineering. When I look at promoting the vision of the framework, I'm hopeful that the body of research that relates to this theme that it will allow me to point to this type of curricular effort as a way to ensure that districts all across our state have an opportunity to implement instructional opportunities for students that align to the vision of the framework. So what could this mean from a state level perspective? So in a state like mine, where instructional materials are guided by state policy, in that we have a governor appointed state textbook committee that reviews materials every year on a subject cycle adoption, and they create an approved list by which districts can use their state dollars to purchase those materials. So again, I'm hopeful that this body of research will help in some way inform that selection process. When I think about sustained adoption and implementation, this is where I get most excited, and I'm very hopeful that the body of research will help answer that original question that Jim Ryan laid out before us, which was who makes these materials happen on a broad scale within a state or across the nation. I think there are many players in the system that impact whether or not the materials get scaled or implemented. But again, I'm hoping that the body of research will really help us understand at various state levels all of the intricate aspects of the ecosystem that allow for or support adoption. Let me give you an example from my own state. Since we've been piloting OpenSciEd, one of the things we recognized is if we can truly have sort of a flipped formula for funding implementation of high quality materials, in that districts are not using their funds to solely purchase the materials, or the materials are at a reduced cost, then how might the districts utilize their state funds that they normally use, or federal funds they normally use for materials, to then support professional development, as we know that professional development and high quality instructional materials go hand in hand for quality implementation. So in our state, we are looking at if schools can purchase these materials at a reduced cost because they're free and open. Can we provide a policy change that allows a waiver in the system to support professional development and showcase that those really do need to go hand in hand? So if the research can really help us understand those state and local policies that support high quality professional development for these high quality materials, I really think that's where our opportunity lies. I'll end my remarks by saying this. There are a lot of opportunities with the research agenda that you've laid out before us so far. But there is one area that I would implore you to really think about. Oftentimes, when research occurs, we think about a district, a classroom, and studying how it impacts a teacher, how it impacts a student. When I think about my position, I think about the incredible opportunity, but sometimes the burden of thinking about how we ensure that every student in our state has this opportunity. So if the research does not focus on scaling and set that as a high priority, I am really afraid that 10, 20 years from now, we will have our districts that have the most funding continuing to provide their students opportunities like we've seen in the pilot with OpenSciEd. However, in parts of the state where I come from, the very rural part of our states, if we don't figure out how to take care of scaling and research doesn't inform us on that, we will continue to see students in the far reaches of our state who will not have access to this wonderful curriculum. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to hearing from my other panelists.
Thank you for that message, Tiffany. Fourth, we'll go to Eileen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to say a few remarks. I conduct equity-focused research from what is called a critical social cultural perspective, and that is the foundation of my remarks. And what that means is that context, including history and power and privilege dynamics held by groups, are central to my view of equity. And that is the lens that I'm bringing to this curriculum. When I'm looking at the research agenda for OpenSciEd, I think it's extremely important to have a clear understanding of what we mean by equity. There are quite a quite a few conceptions of equity. And oftentimes, if equity is not examined intentionally, it is conflated or confused with equality. So it's extremely important that when we pursue these endeavors to address equity, that we actually have a very clear understanding of the goal that we would like to achieve and know when we are achieving those goals related to equity. So the infographic that is showing on the screen, I think does an adequate job of capturing what my conception of equity is. It is an image that I consider to show progress in terms of reaching equity-related goals. It is not ideal, but it is, to me, showing what I call conditions that are becoming more equitable. So in my view of equity, equity primarily lies within the domain of the terrain or the landscape, which is the gray area upon which the crates are sitting, and the gray fence, which is, in my view, represents barriers. To me, that is where equity resides, and that's what we have inequity. For example, for a terrain, we have decades and decades of research and studies that show schools that serve students who come from poverty and have high percentages of those students enrolled in those schools. Those schools tend to have debilitated facilities. They have inadequate materials and equipment for science education. And one of the barriers that these students often face being educated in these environments are teachers are enthusiastic and want to work with these students, but they often have less experience, less preparation, and the science content understanding is not at the level to actually engage in some of the pedagogies that we're advocating in the frameworks for science education. So the typical approach to equity is to add resources, as we see in the infographic. As illustrated by the crates. So we add resources, but we leave the terrain untouched. We leave it intact. We leave any inequities and inequalities that are built into the structures there, and then we try to work within that constrained space. When I look at OpenSciEd research agenda, I tend to see that they're following a typical approach. However, their inclusion of system level drivers like assessment systems provides or creates a space where we can begin to look at the foundational elements of inequities that exist and be able to conduct research that begins to address those in a very substantive way. So whenever I think about equity, I think about a report that was written by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. I think it was in 2019, where they actually identify indicators that we can use to monitor our progress towards more equitable environments and more equitable conditions. And in that report, they identified two axes of equity. There are more axes of equity, but I think the two that were identified in that report are essential to any effort that hopes to create more equitable conditions for scientific learning for a greater swath of the population, US population. And those two axes is access and outcomes. So respect to access, the most prominent I guess elements within that domain are resources and opportunities. So OpenSciEd iterates and focuses on resources in terms of providing materials and preparation experiences for teachers as a way to address the inequities that exist at a certain level of the system, primarily the classroom level and perhaps the district level. And those materials, that increased access that form of equity, or that access to equity, is intended to translate into opportunity, which is another aspect of access, opportunities for students. The second axis of equity that is highlighted in that report is outcomes. And this is the axis related to equity that I think many in the United States are hesitant to address. I think it has to do with a lot of our cultural understandings of meritocracy, and how our education system is structured. But with respect to outcomes, equity in terms of outcomes is extremely important to actually realize the goals that we hope to achieve. So outcomes in terms of Open Science Ed are indicated in the research agenda, but it's not as explicit as some of the other information and directions that are provided within the research agenda. So I would encourage Open Science Ed to think more broadly and more strategically about what do we mean by equitable outcomes and for whom, and be very explicit and intentional of addressing that. Because without addressing it intentionally, it's very, very difficult to make sustained progress in achieving equity. And so I look forward in the future to reading the findings from research that basically begins to address equity in terms of access and in terms of opportunities. For example, Open Science Ed has created a tool that could perhaps allow schools and districts to free up some funds that they would perhaps use in other ways, like buying textbooks and et cetera. So it would be interesting to see if Open Science Ed creates the opportunity for those districts and schools to repurpose those funds and use those funds to improve or enhance the science education equipment that is in these debilitated schools. Or in terms of the preparation that Open Science Ed is preparing for teachers, will it allow these teachers to actually develop such a robust understanding of the science content that they are then able to offer advanced science courses that are not available to students in certain schools, not because they don't have the potential, but because the structure, the way our education system is set up, they do not have that opportunity available to them. So does Open Science Ed prepare these teachers that are working in these environments where there are fewer advantages to actually begin to offer some of the opportunities to students so that they can realize their fullest potential. So I think this is a wonderful project. I think the Open Science Ed research agenda is a fantastic start with the 10 states or more being involved. And I look forward to seeing how these different states come together to actually not only produce outcomes at large scale, but producing substantive outcomes at the system level. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. And finally, we'll go to Trish.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts today as part of this panel. I'm going to be speaking on behalf of science teachers from a national perspective from my roles as a retired classroom teacher from the state of Kentucky and the Chief Learning Officer at the National Science Teaching Association. NSTA has been supporting adoption and implementation of OpenSciEd in districts and schools for the past 3 years. And I would like to comment on both the role of teachers in making the vision into a reality and my recommendations for a research agenda. I consider the OpenSciEd instructional units in the professional learning ecosystem themselves as vision. And vision is really important because it shows what can be. When we work with teachers and leaders in schools using OpenSciEd, most of our discussion or much of our discussion centers on what I call the vision versus the reality. The reality is that teachers are often squeezed between two things: state and local policy and the interest and needs of their students in front of them. And much of our focus at NSTA has centered on helping teachers and leaders navigate these tensions in an effort to achieve the framework and NGSS vision for all students. To prepare for our time today, I've been thinking a lot about how a research agenda can help navigate tensions. First, when I think about the current landscape of instructional materials, two things come to mind. Traditionally, scholars and curriculum developers give instructional units to teachers who in turn give them to students. The OpenSciEd model is flipping this approach, and now we are starting with student equity and agency and using this to guide the development of instructional units. Second, teachers are learning. It takes time to move across the continuum of teacher learning, for example, from novice to expert, and all perspectives are critical and valuable. I argue that as teachers increase their expertise and confidence, they enhance their ability to serve as teacher leaders. So I am framing my discussion of the research agenda for OpenSciEd to promote both teacher leadership and teacher participation with three key examples. Teachers have been playing key roles in developing the OpenSciEd instructional units, as Jim Ryan talked about at the beginning today. And the more teachers that are involved in developing units, the more they are representing the continuum of teachers, and we're more likely to reach our goal of scaling access to high quality instructional materials. I appreciate that teachers have had a critical seat at the table when developing the materials, and I emphasize that this should continue with this research agenda. When thinking about teacher leadership for enacting the vision, I've been thinking about questions like, how is this new breed of teacher leadership taken place? And what is the role of teacher leadership in adoption, implementation, and sustainability? What does it take to expand teacher leadership in these areas? The second consideration is for the teachers that are new to the vision and classroom implementation. As good as the materials are and as involved as teachers have been, what does it take to go to the next step? How can we bring the vision of instructional units to the classroom when we have tensions that we've discussed today, like limited instructional time, limited resources, potential limited professional learning opportunities, and time for teachers to reflect and have dialogue? What are the non-negotiables of the instructional units themselves and the non-negotiables for support of the implementation? And then finally, we've had a lot of conversation today about customization and adaptation, and that's essential for teachers at multiple entry points with diverse student groups and across policy context. But when we're thinking about adaptations that may work in local context, they may also be in opposition to what the original design was. So how do we reconcile this tension? This is one of the most common questions that are brought to us from school leaders, is that negotiation of the local goals and the customization of materials, and then that fidelity to the vision. Some design features may be compromised if they're used for other purposes. So we need teachers to be bold in trying things out, and we want to promote teachers to have agency in adapting instructional units in their local context, especially since students are the foundation for this vision. So finally, going back to my flip it analogy, we hear much about the path from research to practice with this new vision of science education. Let's consider this as a two-way street. There's a lot of potential here to move from practice to research with this new agenda, to have a bottom-up approach where teachers and school district and state leaders are active in the process. This is how we can disrupt change disrupt and change the system that is traditionally marginalized and underserve some students, so that all students can have opportunities for science literacy. So thanks, Kevin, and I look forward to our time answering questions on the panel.
Thank you, Trish, and thanks to all our panelists for taking the time to prepare these really thoughtful comments. So I think we want to enable the videos across our panelists so we can engage as a group. And we've got about 15 minutes before we're scheduled to end to bounce around a few questions. And I think this will give us an opportunity to really dive into a few details to a few of these questions. So the first one I'll pose, and Trish and Tiffany have offered to kind of take the first crack at this, and after they respond, we'll bounce it around the panel. Can you describe the kinds or models of implementation, scale up, and or efficacy research that you think is most needed for OpenSciEd?
I think I'll go ahead and lead off. And I just want to say, Trish, I loved your ending to really start from the bottom up. So thank you so much for that. When we think about scaling, I spoke about that a little bit in the opening remarks, but I think it really comes down to sort of 3 areas of focus. If we want to scale across states, across the nation, I think we have to think about the policies, the funding, and the awareness. Those 3 pieces are really critical when we think about funding. And so the types of research that I think could happen for scaling that would be very, very important as it relates to policies, funding, and awareness is really understanding in various districts what is prompting them or allowing them to implement this curriculum with fidelity. So what funding streams of funding are they using? What braided funding are they using to make this happen? That would inform districts all across the nation, to tell you the truth. What policies at the state and local level are helping them and supporting them to implement, and what policies might be barriers to scaling and implementing. So I think those are very, very important things to consider in this line of research. And I did see a question from a panelist, so I'll just quickly state, if you're thinking about the bottom-up approach that Trish mentioned, specifically with state government or state science supervisors, I just want to also say, I had the pleasure of serving as the president of the Council of State Science Supervisors, which is an organization comprised of all state and territory leads in state and government in the area of science education. And I would say that any of them would be open to hearing from a researcher who might be interested in doing research in their state on scaling and implementation. What you would find is those state science supervisors know the landscape of their state, they know where the barriers exist already, and they can connect you with the districts and help set up those partnerships for the research. In addition to those partnership opportunities, the Council of State Science Supervisors would welcome researchers to present either through webinars to our organization or at our annual conference, and share with us the wealth of research and information that would help us think about leveraging free and open curricular materials that are high quality and all of the support structures that go along with that to really implement this implementation of the vision of the framework in our states. Just keep in mind, it was many of the state science supervisors that signed on as lead states to develop the next generation science standards, and then did the work of really initiating awareness and scaling implementation at a state level. So it's a really great group to work with, the Council of State Science Supervisors. So that's my plug for those that are looking to make those state partnerships.
Thanks, Tiffany. And I'll pick up from there, that going back to, I think one of the things that I emphasized in my remarks, a real need is the customization, adaptation part of the research, which is a cornerstone of OpenSciEd, but there's that tension between the flexibility to adapt and how you maintain the fidelity of the vision, I think is really complicated for schools and districts to navigate. And it may look different at adoption versus implementation versus sustainability. So I'm very interested in seeing some research around that. The second thing that I'll share quickly is around assessment, and this idea that teachers at the table, when it comes to developing, revising, and evaluating assessment tasks connected to this work, could really be a great learning experience for teachers, as well as some interesting research. And then finally, building off of what Tiffany just shared about potential research partners, I was asked to tweet in some social media around this web seminar over the last 24 hours. And on Twitter, I have some responses from teachers that are saying the OpenSciEd materials are great, but they seem way too intimidating for the the teachers that we're working with in our school and district. And so in a way to think about that is, for whatever reason, those teachers aren't at the table. So at NSTA, we've been doing some experimenting with, are there ways to start even prior to the large units, that 4 to 6 week units, with the specific goal of getting teachers to that point of confidence where they would pick up OpenSciEd. And so NSTA would love to have a research partner in trying to figure that out. And since we are thinking about teachers across the nation, and that may be a piece of a research agenda that is about access to OpenSciEd as opposed to the use of OpenSciEd itself. So I'll pass it back to you, Kevin.
Does any other panelists want to add anything to that? All right, let's go ahead and go on to the next question. Thank you for those responses. So the next one is, how could we do more to understand not just what works for OpenSciEd, but also what the critical factors in failure are? And Michael's offered to take a first crack at this one.
Yeah, so basically, my thoughts about that question were around focusing on explanation and being able to explain why things happen the way they do, rather than just description and saying, here's what happened. And I mean, I do understand that there are multiple agendas at play here, and I mean, for very, very good reasons. And some people, because you want to know what works, that's really important, because if you're a policymaker and your responsibility is to make sure that you adopt things that work and show that they work, that's one sort of a goal. It's a different goal, but it's not completely unrelated, to also ask why things work and how they work. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I just wanted to emphasize the description versus explanation issue there. And I'll also say, just in response to the last question, as a former teacher, it helped me personally to be able to understand why things worked so that I could do my job better. Teachers are not automatons, and they're not just told what to do. We're all people, and understanding why things work actually does help you adjust on the fly and help you understand what are the goals and how do you get to the goals, and am I getting there? And if I'm not getting there, then I understand that I'm not getting there. I understand why. So explanation is also involved in the success of this effort overall.
I would just like to add that sort of a plug for mixed method research methodology. I think when you're looking at instances where your initiative doesn't fare as well as you wanted, or it doesn't achieve the goals, I think having the qualitative lens to do a deep dive in terms of documenting what was done along the way, what was the context in which this initiative was implemented, how does that context differ from a context in which the initiative was successful. So I think the qualitative methodologies would help with that in terms of just bustering the explanation that Michael highlighted there. So I think a mixed methodology, if you're wanting to learn from your failures, that having that detailed information is very important, and from different stakeholders, from your teachers, from your students, from the principals, district level leaders, to find out where the breakdown happened. And usually it happens along different places along that implementation. And so you can do a deeper investigation to see where the breakdowns are.
Any others? Thank you both for those. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Angela and Eileen had some thoughtful comments on equity. I think this follows up on that, and maybe an opportunity to elaborate on that. For instance, what are some specific ways that research studies can foreground equity from both student and teacher perspectives and at different system levels like classroom, district, state, and so on?
Again, I'm coming from a critical social culture perspective, so I look more at structures. I think the work, a lot of equity work has been done for many, many decades. And so there is a lack of will that exists, right? So I think it's imperative that the equity-focused research that is being done, that there are intentional efforts to translate that work into practice, into policy, into curriculum development. Because I think oftentimes with the research in general, we conduct our basic research and we sort of disseminate that, but we leave it upon people, other stakeholders, to figure out how do we change this, how do we implement this. So I think for the OpenSciEd research agenda, for those who are conducting the equity-focused research, that there be an intentional effort to look at the various ways in which this translate into specific practices and policies. And I think the flip side of that is, again, I look at power and privilege dynamics of groups. Even though we talk about equity being one of our goals, I think we need to step back and truly think about what would that look like? And what kinds of forces in terms of power and privilege do you encounter when you try to create these more equitable outcomes and more equitable conditions? And researchers need to think about that when they think about how to translate these research findings into action.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And Eileen, it also really resonated with me earlier when you were suggesting that the research agenda really could be much more explicit about what's meant by equity for which students, which teachers, which contexts. And so when I think about this question, I do think about being more intentional about paying attention to context and collaborating with the diversity of schools and communities as partners, taking the time to understand their perspectives and interests, and especially when it comes to questions around racial equity, making sure that we're listening to the perspectives of students, educators, and researchers of color. And I think an equity-centered approach would include opportunities for collaboratively identifying questions, exploring findings, and thinking together about implications of those findings. And when I also think about this question, I think about equity in terms of doing more to support collaboration among the researchers working on this. The research agenda is really ambitious, and no one group is going to be able to go deep around all of these questions or focus on all aspects of the education system. And Kevin, you actually illustrated that really nicely in your opening remarks. And so I think we need to leverage this research agenda in an ongoing way to intentionally and actively facilitate collaboration among researchers and really staying centered on the needs of students and teachers first, and doing whatever it takes in terms of sharing knowledge, methods, and insights openly around these different pieces of the puzzle to support the work of educators in classrooms and in schools.
And Kevin, can I just add a comment on the back end of Angela's comment there? I think it's important too, in terms of if you're having these alliances, that within those alliances, there needs to be some difficult discussions and coming to a consensus of what do we mean by equity? And what would more equitable conditions look like, and how do we get there? And I think that takes a concerted effort, and I can't remember if it was Trish or Tiffany that indicated it needs to be done in concert from bottom up and top down, that everyone is working towards a shared, agreed upon vision. And I think that's crucial for the research on equity to make any kind of significant impact.
Thank you so much. And this is the perfect juncture for us to move to our closing segment. Thanks again to all our panelists for providing these important perspectives, engaging in this really stimulating conversation. Before we adjourn, I want to briefly mention what's coming next. I think we have just a few closing slides. So what's coming next, and acknowledge the contributors to this webinar. So as I mentioned, adjust my screen. Here we go. After we elaborate and refine these themes into a research agenda document based on the feedback we get, we'll share it on our webpage. We also plan to support the development of new research proposals that leverage OpenSciEd. So we have some funds set aside for seed grants to help researchers get their ideas off the ground. We'll share resources that can help proposal writers. And we're also happy to facilitate new partnerships and connections based on mutual interests and needs. So just a few acknowledgements. Thanks to the members of the Digital Promise OpenSciEd team for the work behind the scenes. I'm genuinely honored to represent this group today. Thanks to our program committee members who really expertly co-facilitated our working group meetings and have otherwise just continued to steer us in all the right directions throughout this whole process. So special thanks to them. And then finally, many thanks to all our working group participants. The biggest thanks to the folks who participated in these meetings and whose insights and efforts are reflected here. Really a pleasure to get to know everyone and engage in those discussions. Thanks to Danny Edelson, Kate McNeil, Bill Penuel, Jim Ryan, Sarah Delaney, Matt Crable, for their ongoing feedback and helpful conversations over the course of many months. And finally, thanks, of course, to Jim Short for our back and forwards about OpenSciEd, and to the Carnegie Corporation for making this work possible. So as we depart, I'll leave up on this last slide a list of ways that you can stay connected. Is that slide? Here we go. Stay connected to the ongoing effort. Thank you all so much for attending today, and have a great rest of the week.